Going into the final round of the Grand Slam final in Bilbao, Fabiano, Caruana and Magnus Carlsen were sharing the lead. How hard would they press in their final games to go for that outright victory? Well, we had the answer from Caruana fairly quickly. He offered an early repetition against his opponent Vallejo, who accepted, so a very quick draw. So he was waiting in the clubhouse to see how Carlsen would get on against Aronian. Well, Carlsen tried to keep a bit of play in the position, but Aronian was very solid, and that game ended also in a draw. So Carlsen and Caruana joined first at the end of the tournament, and they had a tie-break. 2 blitz games to decide the champion. Caruana was white in the first blitz game, and he started with e4. Now, some people were speculating perhaps he'd been able to sit out this round in effect and would be less tired, but I don't know. Well, let's see what happens. Carlsen played the Berlin defense of the Spanish, and this is a very, very solid variation, as we know, and I think an excellent variation for blitz, because black has no real weaknesses, and if white is going to make progress here, well, as we know in standard classical games, you have to play very precisely indeed, and that's in a blitz game is very difficult indeed. I think this is an excellent practical choice. Now let me just leap ahead in the game to move 25. This is position with white to play. I think already things have gone quite well for Carlsen. Such a typical position for this variation. White still has this pawn majority on the king side, 4 against 3, but it's very hard to mobilize it. You can see, really white needs to push with f4, f5, but that's just not happening in this position at all. And black's minor pieces are very nicely placed. The knight blockading superbly, blockading this e-pawn, which obviously restricts the scope of this bishop, and this light squared bishop on c6 looking very nicely placed as well. Okay, not doing much at the moment, but still very nicely placed. So white isn't really getting anywhere here. This knight on b5 isn't really doing too much, and I think now is the time to reroute that knight, perhaps trying to come into d5. I understand why Caruana didn't want to do this, because knight d4 is very double-edged, and I think now you can see one of the drawbacks of this pawn formation. This b3 pawn is potentially, in some variations, quite weak. So yeah, I think in a blitz game this is tough for white. Okay, Caruana played rook d2, and now g5 from Carlsen. So he's taking the initiative here, and I have to say Carlsen was playing his moves so quickly, and Caruana was already under some time pressure. The time control was 4 minutes. Both sides get 4 minutes for all their moves, and they get 3 seconds time increment per move. But Caruana was already running short of time. Okay, he took, and now rook e3 to guard the b3 pawn. Well, okay, that's understandable, that's not too bad. Now rook e8 from Carlsen, just bringing the rook around to the g file. Excellent, increasing the pressure. Now knight c3. I think that this is a good idea to bring the knight back into play. But after knight e4, well, you can see there could be potential trouble here. In fact, white is still okay here. He can play knight e2. Now, obviously, after the exchange of knights, that will kind of dampen down the position, and I think white is okay. They're heading for a draw. Black could still play knight e6 to keep some tension in the position, and then the knight might come back. Black can try to play this position on, but okay, it should be roughly level. That will get exchanged off, and I think white is fine. But Caruana, under pressure, played knight e4, and this is just a straight blunder. Perhaps it's unfair to analyse these blitz games in too much detail. I remember Miguel Najdorf, the great Miguel Najdorf. I remember watching him playing some blitz games, and the game ended. Najdorf won the game, and afterwards his opponent said, "Oh yeah, what about this? What about this? What about this?" And Najdorf just said, "One should never analyse blitz games." So maybe it's a little unfair of us to pick these games apart. Anything can happen when you're running short of time. But knight e4, it's a blunder. Carlsen took on e5, and this does not just lead to some exchange of pawns and pieces, because after rook takes d4, f5 simply wins a piece due to this pin. So Caruana had to just back down. Now in this position he's 2 pawns down. If white takes on d4, then the rook comes in and heads for the weak pawn on b3. White should be lost in this position. So Caruana played rook f2, but he's just 2 pawns down for nothing. There's just one final finesse which is worth looking at. In this position, Carlsen played very practically. He gave a pawn back here, actually. White should probably take on d4, and after rook c5, black is still a clear pawn up, and has excellent winning chances here. But instead Caruana flicked in pawn takes pawn. Obviously he wants to try and, after black recaptures here, he wants to take on d4 and hopefully head for a draw. But Carlsen had foreseen c5. He played these moves so quickly, and now white is utterly lost, because that protected pass pawn is just too much, and the game ended like this. And d3, and the rook comes behind the pawn, and that is the end of that. Game over. So a really convincing victory from Carlsen. He played so quickly. So they now went into game 2. Let me just switch over the boards. Game 2. So Carlsen is 1 up. Caruana had to win this game with the black pieces in order to force a final tie-break game. So let's see what happened. Carlsen played e4, and once again, instead of playing an open Sicilian and mainline theory, Carlsen played a sideline g3. Well, this is not a bad move. It's an interesting one. You can still go back into an open Sicilian later on with d4, but it's inviting black to play with d5 and then play d4, and this is quite a sharp position actually. The English player Luke McShane has played this a couple of times with some success actually. He played it in last year's London Chess Classic, for example, although he drew that game against Nakamura, but it was an interesting position. Caruana played b6. Not a bad idea at all, inviting Carlsen to go into an open Sicilian, which he did. You don't have to play like this. In fact, white can play with d4 and c3 and d4. So it's not a bad plan. But okay, d4 is quite a healthy open Sicilian position for white, because this is perhaps prematurely placed on b7. There are certain tactical possibilities that white has, as we're about to see. Carlsen played a very tricky move, rook d1. When you get bishops opposed like this, there are always tactics involving e5. Now it doesn't work in this position, because after bishop takes g2, pawn takes knight, black can take on f1, and white has to recapture because the bishop threatens the queen, and black is simply material up in this position. But rook d1 is a very sneaky move. Of course it's a useful move anyway, looking opposite black's queen. And Carlsen was playing these moves so quickly, and Caruana, who had run short of time in that first blitz game, was trying to blitz at the same speed as Carlsen. he should play queen b8 here, which protects the bishop. And then white has a number of different possibilities. I mean, maybe knight a3 to knight c4. You could also play to try and target the d pawn. You could also play more traditionally with knight c3 or a4. But Caruana played a6, going for a standard Sicilian position with bishop e7 and castles, and of course preventing knight b5. But this allowed a horrible tactic, e5, and suddenly the game is over. Of course, if the pawn is taken, white captures the bishop on b7. So bishop takes g2. Now we don't take on g2, but instead pawn takes knight. If the bishop retreats back to b7, then knight e6 is absolutely crushing. If this is taken, queen takes, and then pawn takes g7, and pawn goes through. And after bishop b7, knight e6, if queen f6, of course, we have a devastating discovered check. Caruana played bishop h3 instead to protect e6. However, that allowed queen h5, a devastating move, attacking the bishop. And it's all over. If the bishop retreats to f5, then we have knight takes bishop. And this is absolutely horrendous. Rook e1 check, and it's all going horribly wrong. These pins on the e-file are just too much. Well, Caruana took on f6 instead. But now queen takes bishop, and white is a whole piece up, and well, just after a few more moves, Caruana resigned. Let's just see those final moves. I'm afraid nothing very special at all. And here, Caruana resigned. So, Magnus Carlsen is our champion, the Grand Slam final champion of 2012. I think a deserved victor after these crushing blitz games, actually. But Caruana has had a really splendid tournament as well. I just remind you of some of his results in 2012. He was first in Reggio Emilia, he was second in Vicence, he was first in the Reykjavik Open, second in the Tal Memorial, he was first in Dortmund, and in the Olympiad he scored 6.5 out of 9 on top board, and then equal first in this tournament. So Caruana has really made great strides this year. But Carlsen, of course, reigns supreme. He's #1 on the rating list, and he's approaching Garry Kasparov's all-time record of 28.51. I'm not quite sure. I think he's not quite there, but almost there. So there we go. Thanks very much for watching, and do join me soon on my YouTube channel PowerPlayChess for more of these clips. Thanks very much.